So basically, I have shmups on the brain, and
All right.
games that feature lots of bullets, and they are some of my favorites. And you are making one.
I am making one. Well, kind of. It's a soft shmup.
Hmm.
Is how I guess I like to think that we're partway between a shmup, which is like the Japanese games are shmups. I think games with a pushing screen where you're propelled through. It's almost like a maze made of either bullets or enemies or something that's
Yeah.
old, facing. And then they have the Western approach from the old arcade days, where I don't know if I'd call games like Smash TV and Robotron a shmup, but
Mm.
they're kind of in a similar space. They're about player control, where you have the ability to move around in 360 degrees and aim in 360 degrees, and the gameplay is not so much like a maze. It's kind of the East versus West design philosophy as well.
Mhm.
The whole
Mhm.
origami thing that they have going on over there.
Cool. So yeah, go ahead and drop the name for those who don't know of your game and
Well,
yeah.
all right, so I guess I can introduce myself as well. I'm Sanatan Mishra. I am one of the three people over here in Brisbane, Australia, that's making a game called Assault Android Cactus. The number one thing I've learned about naming games is don't put Android in the title unless you're making a game Android platform. It's not an Android game. It is, in fact, a twin-stick shoot 'em up for consoles and PC. Yeah, very, very fast, hectic arcade slash Dreamcast style game is kind of
Cool.
the space I would put it in.
Very cool. And yeah, it's up to 4 players, right?
Yeah, it is up to four players. It's an interesting point about the game actually that we don't get to I think express or talk about a lot is the difference between when it's a single player game or a co-op game because
Mhm.
primarily we actually built it as a single player game. For a very long time it didn't even have multiplayer. But then often, as soon as you have co-op in something, it often gets retroactively viewed as a co-op experience that you can play by yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, that happens a lot.
Yeah.
Cool. So you wanted to talk about, let me just pull up the note here.
Sure.
The overarching design goal to align the most enjoyable ways of playing your game with the most dominant ways of playing, right? So this is
That,
a balance issue, right? So the game is we're assuming there's enough pieces in the game so it has its own distinct feel, its own controls, its own flavor, and now we're considering what's going on from the point of view of when people are going through levels, when they are going for high score or trying to do really well. How do we balance this idea of, playing for fun or what the most interesting actions are versus just trying to survive or ways to cheese the game? I think is that a good interpretation?
yeah, that's bang on. I think, cheesing it or like the sense that in life, everything will eventually at some point find and take the path of least resistance because that's how we operate, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Cool.
so if your game has a path that they can take that's less resistant and less enjoyable, they're probably still going to take it. And I do this myself. I think everyone does this when they play a game. I cheese the hell out of bosses in Dark Souls and Demon Souls. And it's fun the fact that I stand in a doorway and slice them through, with my
Yeah.
whip that happens to collision.
There's
So
a
yeah, that's kind of the
there's a giant pig in Bloodborne. A pig enemy. He's kind of freaky, pretty scary the first time I encountered him, but the first time I found him, I had worked my way along the back streets and down this long ladder and ended up coming into the sewers from behind. So I saw him from behind. I'm like, "Hey, is that a giant enemy I've never seen before?" And it chased me back to the doorway, but I'm like, "Oh, you're way too big to get in the doorway, so let me just hit you from as far away as possible and feel good about myself." Yeah.
I think I feel that the exact same way because you can, right? And so that's within the rules of the game. That's the way to succeed, and you can absolutely, do what you can to succeed how you can.
Correct.
Um, Something that I think about a lot with our design, in particular with a game like ours, which, I mean, in Bloodborne's case, that's less of a kind of concern. I think that you need to balance out those aspects because it's not a high score chasing, it's not a kind of competitive between players in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no inclination where you want it to feel like the ways to succeed most are the ways where you're playing kind of properly or like in the intended fashion.
Yeah.
Um, so in our case, it's been a big driving goal for me is to try and think of like, and Tim as well. You know, he's the other designer slash animator slash programmer slash artist. He pretty much makes the entire game, and I just sit there and do what I can. Um, but yeah, a big thing for us early on was trying to figure out how we could align those elements. And you said you're kind of into shoot 'em ups, so I'm assuming you played a lot of games like Geometry Wars and Super Stardust kind of thing.
Yeah, I
The modern take
played
on that.
Geometry Wars 1 and 2 and the DS one and the Wii one I bought. I love Ikaruga. I played Bangai on the Dreamcast, and my favorite Bangai is the DS version, Spirits. I really like that one.
Hmm.
And plenty of other sort of Firepower 2000 type games and Jamestown. Shoutouts to indies there. And yeah, shmups are
Great.
cool.
That's awesome. They're great games. And then I think when you move to the more twin sticking side of that, you see a lot of games that move away from the purity of the shoot 'em up and try to introduce other more elements. You've got like Dead Nation and games of that kind of style. And one thing I consistently find in these games, in the ones that are worse, I guess, in the space, is that you often find yourself being rewarded for or finding like methods to cheese that involve not interacting with the game as much. So hiding in a corner that happens to have limited amount of ways things can get at you, or even the idea that as you lose lives or as you get closer to death, you start playing more safe. So even if a game has a combo or a chain mechanic that encourages you to recklessly go out and kill things really quickly, if you start to fail at the game, or it's the harder point in the game, you start abandoning those more interesting mechanics in favor of more guaranteed, I'm going to live for another 10 minutes, so now I'm going to sit in the corner as much as possible, run away as much.
Yeah.
And that's like a really common trend, I think, that gets exemplified the less pure the gameplay is. Geometry Wars does a really good job of balancing the two with its tight, like very small arena and enemy types that push and pull in different directions.
So let's chat real quick about Geometry Wars, because back in the early days, it came out on 360. It was a great game, blaring my own soundtrack through the speakers and just kind of enjoying the HD spectacle of the fireworks. But the first Geometry Wars, for me, had this big issue of the dominant strategy where you move away from the enemies in a big circle and you fire into your wake, and there's little that most enemies could do about it. The thing that broke that up the most were the sort of black hole Cheerio enemies, the snakes that appear every now and then, and the red shielded enemies that like to run at you at high speed. So waiting for the game to get good, you wait for those enemies to start spawning more and more frequently, and you kind of keep up your routine. Sure, the bomb kind of kills your high score multiplier, but for the most part, would you say that's how it plays?
I think that's really good assessment, and that's absolutely one of the games that's better about avoiding that trap of the eternally playing safe to keep the game going, because it does have those enemies that force you to kind of actually turn around and go back through them, or like the black holes, which so you need to shoot the black hole. You can't just leave it be, right? And run away. So there's really cool elements that shift and try to change that. But even still, it runs into that kind of style, like you're saying. So I think that's a really good assessment. And as you go to worse in the genre, I think that problem gets exemplified.
Oh, I thought Geometry Wars 2 did a great job with some of their alternative modes, like pacifism, and even Geometry Wars Waves. That did a really neat job of creating this situation where you at least can't do the same movement that you did before in a big circle. It encourages in new paths and new ways of cutting through enemies and new reasons to leave certain enemies down for a little bit and then focus on other areas. So yeah, across all the Geometry Wars, there's a wide spectrum of different types of levels, but a lot of good stuff in there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Actually, Tim is here now, so if you want to take a seat on the couch, Tim, we'll make space.
Cool.
There we go. I think we got both.
Hey, Tib.
Introduce yourself, Tim.
Well, and yeah.
Tim Dawson. He is one of the other people who works on the game.
Mm-hmm.
It's his original concept. He does all the art, all the programming. We work on the design together. And yeah, that's basically it. So we were just actually talking about, I'm pretty versed in this stuff. It's the concept of like path of least resistance, dominant methods of playing games versus kind of the interesting way to play them, or the way that like is most enjoyable for people to play them, and how you'll actually shift mindset. Like you'll shift towards the easy ways of kind of getting through things, even if it's not the most exciting way to play the game, because naturally that's what we do.
Yeah. I remember early on I was thinking one of the really important things I thought for the game was that when you concentrate, you should get better at it. You shouldn't be able to fall into autopilot, because you always do to some degree. Like you're always just kind of playing it by the numbers, and you fall back on patterns you used to. But when you're really chasing those high scores, it had to become really important that you had to start thinking, what can I do from moment to moment, and like what activity can I take to excel beyond just kind of. You can't grind a score.
Yeah.
I think it comes back to the thing you were saying as well. You get into that pattern where you're making the same movements over and over.
Yeah.
So because we identified like that early on, and we like one of the really earliest things we did when we were first deciding if this was even going to be the project we wanted to spend the next year, which has now turned into 2.5 years, working on the game doing, was we played through all the twin stick shooters that were available on Steam or Xbox Live Arcade, PlayStation Network on 360, PS3 at the time, to try and get a cross section. And it turned out to be this is the really common core of twin stick games, where there's not something like we were talking before about shoot 'em ups. They force you through like a maze of bullets or enemies and things like that, whereas twin sticks are much more about the freedom of expression through movement.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of identified that, and at the time, Cactus in the early prototype stage actually had lives around this time.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. At one point, the original, the earliest working version of Cactus had livestock, and actually, I never implemented livestock, but it was supposed to be there. It was designed around livestock, and between level upgrades.
Yeah.
You'd actually there was going to be a progression system. I actually had the shop system in and working, and it's all kind of there.
And what we immediately found was playing, our own prototype, or the first time I played it, there was lots of reasons to go out and kill things. There was the concept of high scores, getting high score by destroying things really quickly, earning lots of the pickups that the enemies dropped. So when the enemies were defeated, they were going to drop something of some value that you'd use to upgrade, or something else later. We're accustomed to video games. When we're collectible, we want to collect it inherently. So there are carrots out there for you to kind of want to go and get. But I think the first time I played for a while, I was doing really well. The level started to get harder, and I died. I got knocked down. I got back up, and then I started to run away, and I found some sections in the level where I could basically be invulnerable because they were melee enemies.
Oh, yeah.
Of them that walked slowly, and they had a lot of space. But if I was in this corner, there was only 2 angles they could come at me from, and I could shoot them as they came in. And it was this moment of, I can play the game this way, and people will play the game this way, and it felt hollow, I guess. So when we started talking about alternatives, ways that you could try and the exciting way to play is not like that. How can we make it so that the rewarding way to play is the same as the exciting way to play? Yeah. I'm like, do you want to take?
Yeah. So and the main thing from a design point of view, we identified that we needed something that made basically corralling the enemies or pulling them off or postponing the gameplay. That needed something that would stop that or prevent that. Not just encourage you to seek them out. We needed something that was going to punish you for not seeking them out. And so it was. We were kind of thinking, we're thinking of different timers, and because it's very video games, it's got this awesome selection of, game history to think about now. I'm thinking, so timers, some sort of thing. At one point, somebody was kind of saying if they weren't synthetic characters, you'd expect it to maybe be like an oxygen tank or something, kind of like Dig Dug kind of thing, which is a similar method of forcing you to continue to stick your neck out.
Yeah.
And at one point we settled on a timer earlier. I think we had spinning numbers at the top of the stage. The problem is you can't read a spinning number with your peripheral vision. You can't tell what if you can't tell the difference between 37 and 15 easily at a glance.
Yeah.
You'd have to look up and for a moment on the number. So we replaced it with the meter because it was kind of easier to just the corner of your eye. But
and there's also like the other element where like if you looked at through the history of arcade games, you have the concept of checkpoints and timers, outrun, that kind of thing. You're pushing towards the next checkpoint. But even something like that in the context of when we tried it, I don't think the earliest versions had a collectible, did they? It was just a timer on the stage.
Yeah, we had a few different ideas for that, and it's like what advances the time,
what ticks it down, whether it was like you have 30 seconds and you defeat the wave and then it refreshes, that kind of concept were things that we were thinking about. And that kind of worked for the sense that you now had to defeat everything, and so if you found a slow dominant method that was safe, it was no longer viable, but it was still kind of like not interacting with the level in the same way that if you played a shoot 'em up and it pushes the screen, you're forced to move forward through these interesting kind of gameplay scenarios that you can't just be a passive observer.
So eventually we settled on the idea of the dropping battery pickup or the time pickup. I think in the code it's still called time. It's just called, all internally it's got, because it was before it was.
The logic is time, the in-world reasoning and justification that makes sense to a player in the context of the game is a battery.
Sometimes when I'm looking up internal assets, I have to remember, that was once. But and so one of the reasons, not mentioned it before, was that one of the reasons why it's a collectible and it doesn't just get added to your battery was, first of all, we wanted to make it kind of an event. We wanted to draw the player's attention to it, so you've got this rhythm. The second one was by dropping the battery where the enemy dies, it generally drops in the pack of enemies. Mm-hmm. So you get the situation where if you're keeping your distance from a whole bunch of melee enemies, suddenly something you want appears in the melee enemies, and then added in it to make it bounce away from your current position. So that's on purpose. I get people reporting it as bugs every now and then. Going, the battery seems to like roll. It's like, it's meant to do that. And that's just, so you can outrange enemies, shoot them, and then eventually the game says, and now you have to, you can run through them, you can deplete them, you can wait a little bit. It's okay, you can deal with this however you want to deal with it, but you have to deal with it because you need that battery.
I hadn't actually gone over our battery yet.
Oh, right.
So that's why I was, it's good that you went there. It's just,
that reminds me
that I'd talk.
Oh yeah, it reminds me a lot of one of the big changes they made for Geometry Wars, I guess DS, Wii, and Geometry Wars 2. They added the gold gem drops when you defeat enemies. So even if you can run away from a lot of them and shoot behind you to destroy them, they leave that incentive behind, and you kind of want to double back around to grab them. And then the fastest way to double back around is just stopping and then reversing, but that's also the most dangerous. So right there they packed in that sort of risk-reward balance. Pretty cool.
And that's where our battery kind of like, actually, because we looked at those things and we had a lot of collectibles and power-ups that are really valuable already in the game. When you defeated an enemy, they were dropping white orbs that would make your gun stronger, which makes the level easier, but that's kind of like an incentive to do better and defeat things quicker, which again, if you found a safe way to defeat things you didn't care too much about. And they also had power-ups that they would like machine gun drones and shutdowns and acceleration, which we kind of like when we're describing them, we look at those as those are the carrots. Getting a higher score, being the best at the game, defeating things quickly, getting power-ups, getting pickups, being cool, being an angel of death inside the game that feels powerful and amazing. That's a carrot. Mm-hmm. People are going to want that because it's good. But if they don't need it, they can still ignore it. And that's when the battery kind of came in as this the sidestep to now we have the carrot and we have the stick that catches you if you're ignoring the carrot. Mm-hmm. So by having this absolute failure that occurs if you just ignore all of this completely, we now shifted people to the mindset of, okay, I have to get the battery, so now that I have to already go out there, maybe I should collect all these other power-ups that make my gun better. Maybe I should collect the pickups that give me the acceleration. And the moment you start doing it, you actually realize that in our game, the easiest way to play the game is not actually the apparent dominant strategy, but it's to be aggressive and become powerful and collect all these things. It's just kind of, you have to become a hurdle early on of understanding how to play in order to get to the level where you know how valuable a power-up is. So it's this kind of dual carrot-stick approach to trying to align those things. And I think it really works for our player base so far.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things I'm very happy with is we kind of built a almost like a conveyor belt of incentives. So the first incentive is if you do not pick up the battery, if you do not play the game fast enough to keep ahead of the battery, and that's pretty easy. That's not too challenging at all. But you have to do it. If you start ignoring the battery, it's tuned aggressively enough that you will just battery out and die. But once you go, okay, I can't ignore the battery, and you go, okay, I have to be a little bit fast. I have to actually be a little bit aggressive. The next thing you kind of start asking is like the level ends, and it'll give you like a C rank. And people's response to that is really good, because the thing they ask is, well, how do I get a B rank?
Yeah.
And then it's like, and so they get interested, is like, can I get a better rank then? And so they play it again, and they go, oh, I got a B or an A, and they start seeing that there's a chain counter that comes up, and it's big and animates, and everyone likes a chain counter. It comes up and, oh, I'm chaining enemies together. This feels good. So can I keep doing this? And each step of the way, it leads them down the path of the game, until eventually the end goal is obviously they look at the leaderboards and go, can I beat that guy ahead of me? And that's the high score. That's a very pure. That at this point they're really deep into the game, and now they're chasing like almost the purest part of the game. But there's this like conveyor belt that starts off from like, how not to die all the way up.
Go ahead.
I was going to say one thing to me about that. Like there's influence. We've talked about its influence on player mentality and kind of the way that they're psychologically driven to experience more of the game and more of the way that the game is kind of designed that way. But it has like such far-reaching and it has such a far-reaching effect on the game design itself, because a lot of those other systems, the specific way we do the chain and the timers and the things like that actually come out of then the necessity of they need the timers counting down, defeating enemies quickly, how many enemies can be in a wave, how many enemies before a battery. So it's not like you would design a game and then implement this as a system, part and parcel of, at the earliest stage, building blocks. You account for this kind of design decision. I think that's really important to how integral this stuff is.
There was a really amazing moment actually when I first realized that the timer mechanic or the battery mechanic was needed for the game, or was better for the game, and I started assessing the rest of what the game was, and it felt like tugging on a string that just like unraveled entire systems. And it was kind of heartbreaking. I'd programmed a working shop system. This was in the prototype, and it worked. You could go to it, and you could select things, and you could buy upgrades and all that stuff. And as I started like following the implications of this time system, the first thing I realized is that lives could go away because they were not necessary. If getting knocked down is slower than not getting knocked down, playing slower is how you die. And it's like, oh, it's already taken care of. The other big problem is multiplayer. How do I deal with livestock? Like any arcade game with livestock and multiplayer, you can end up with like the good player is still alive and all his friends have used up their lives and he's just playing by himself. Yeah. Or you can end shared livestock where the bad players just steal all the continues from everyone else and stuff like that. And it's like, is that right? And this made it go away because the battery is shared. It's just collectively. You either win or you lose together. And actually solved that more elegantly than any solution I had on the table. It's like, oh, good. So I ended up taking out the life system. I ended up taking out any kind of, the only punishment for getting knocked down is you lose your current power-up rank and some time. Yeah. And the cost of getting knocked down, basically, in gameplay.
And it let us do nice things as well. Like when you get knocked down, it drops a portion of the orbs you were carrying.
That was a really late
Yeah.
mission though. That was kind of like a finishing touch.
It's probably something I wouldn't have done if we did livestock necessarily,
no,
though,
it didn't
because
make any sense.
now you're losing your weapon level, and the weapon level is everything to your ability to defeat enemies quickly. So it's sort of, it has an effect on your ability to live, but it's not directly tied. So now we drop them, and then the other players can rush to where you died and steal them from you before you resurrect, and it's
So
just enough way.
yeah.
Okay.
Two interesting questions. You talked about how the battery and then the upgrade system, and then eventually working through those systems gets you to a place where you're playing the game that you think is in the most interesting way as intended, and also you are competing against people potentially on the leaderboards. So is that to say that you think the people who would get the max scores or the highest scores on the leaderboards will be also playing into these systems as you described, just more efficiently, better, like more accurate shots, quicker dispatching of the enemies? Is that how they get that high, or is there some kind of? Do you think there's some kind of hidden other kind of strategy lurking under the surface?
No, I think we've had an amazing job. Like a lot, because obviously people are YouTubing their videos, so we get to watch how they play, and the best players are just playing the game like I dreamed people would.
It's very lean. I mean, they're doing things I didn't expect. There are some strategies with some of the bosses where I thought, this doesn't break any of the rules. It's not a bug what they're doing. They're moving through areas where technically it's kind of looks dangerous, and using weapons in ways I hadn't anticipated, which is really nice.
That's cool.
But it's all working the rule set of the way that we want you to accelerate at the game.
They're being hyper aggressive and they're taking every opportunity. What they're not doing, and what I think you're getting at, is that, and what I'd be worried about is if they were doing things like stopping shooting for a while and waiting for some optimal time, or doing some kind of weird thing that doesn't feel like it's in world.
Yeah.
It makes them look like they're a fighting robot, but they're actually just like gaming a system.
Yeah.
And we actually have really any of those. And
There's a nice.
I've been scared that would be the case the whole time. It's worked out.
There's a nice kind of element to it when I watch people play at the top level in our game, where it kind of can look and feel like a shoot 'em up. Where when I watch people play Ikaruga, they look like they're constantly on the edge of death. They're skirting with absolute failure at any moment that could make the last 10 minutes of their life a waste, right? But they're just that close to it.
Yeah.
And they have to be, because that they need to get that close in order to shave off the amount of, make sure they're dealing the optimal amount of damage to cut down the time. And I feel like intrinsic games, you can often get to a point where you never get that level of kind of refinement of the reward for putting yourself in that much danger is rarely worth it. And I feel like we've got a game where it is worth it because everything is time-based, everything is built into that lean of the system.
There's a couple of things that facilitate. We don't. Our health system is rare that it's not one-shot death. It's you've got 5 hit points.
Yeah. And
it regenerates. So if you go a couple of seconds without getting hit, those hit points come back. Your shield. And it functions a little bit like the same way it does in Halo, where it encourages you to take a little bit of damage, not to worry about it, as long as you're constantly not taking damage, like as long as you can go large stretches out. And so you see some of these strategies is that it's actually okay to hit a couple of bullets on the way into a dangerous area if it gets you the result. But the difference between failure, getting knocked down and never having to give up that run because no point continuing, and success is like so thin. They're sitting there on like 1 hit point and the alarm's going on and it's like, and they didn't that wasn't a mess up. They were actually like using that. It's like, that's correct. Like this is
Interesting.
Risk strategy.
Yeah, I've seen some Halo matches where they nearly get their entire shield wrecked, and they go out back into the danger and start backing up their teammates. I'm like, what are you doing? Get behind something. But they know exactly what they're doing with the coordinated pressure from their teammates. They're safe, and they're just adding to the firepower, so that's pretty cool.
As long as you're sure you're not going to get hit in the next 5 seconds, you're fine.
Well, one thing I did to illustrate high score chases actually was I didn't want any random logic for what power-ups you drop.
Interesting.
Technically, the game should be completely reproducible if you do the exact same actions. So, for instance, the power-ups I timed off level time. So the power-up that dropped, and in normal levels this doesn't matter so much because it's so varied anyway, but in boss encounters, the power-up the boss will drop when it breaks a phase is determined by what second you're on when you destroy that boss. And that was intentional, like the second is quite coarse so that you can actually reproduce it. And when we were testing it, the yellow pickup dropped, that meant we're a second slower than we usually are, because normally it would have been the red one.
Yeah.
And players pick up on this as well, and they use this for their strategies.
That's really
they'll
cool.
know that. But it doesn't make the game uninteresting or like something you'd wiki. It just becomes a strategy. And so people talking about maybe if we use blue pickup in this phase, it'll actually be more effective against this part. And there's different. Yeah, that's really exciting as well. It held up really well.
There's an article I'm writing for the blog pretty soon. It's still in the Pac-Man series, but I looked into what high-level Pac-Man play looks like, and typically Pac-Man, the way people normally understand it is, you play on your toes, you move around, you're like, hey, watch out for the ghosts, and you do really well. Learn a little bit about their AI personalities, and you can anticipate openings that most people wouldn't be able to see. That's all great. But on the highest difficulty level of Pac-Man, because, it ramps up and up and up, and then it kind of caps off at a difficulty level, people have learned these strategies where they master entire paths through the entire system, and because the entire game, including Ghost AI, is deterministic, there's no random elements in there, and everything works on like these set timers. They've memorized these paths to where they can do stuff that seems impossible, and like frame by frame, like if a Ghost and Pac-Man pass through each other, pixel like 1 frame difference is the difference between hitting a ghost or they both skip each other just because they both move 1 frame forward at the perfect timing. They have strategies where they coordinate multiple of those super lucky passes, but because everything's set in stone, they could do that. And so in the article I talk a little bit about like what are the pros and cons of designing a system that's super deterministic? Like what's the fear? Is it that people will memorize these elaborate strategies? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And I talked a little bit about it. But like you're saying, I really like the idea of putting in these reproducible deterministic systems so players can sink their teeth into it and start to do things, take more control over a game. I really like that.
And it's an interesting as well, again, I keep coming back to the distinctions between them, but the shoot 'em up versus the twin stick game, and like the shoot 'em up is 100% deterministic by design. The screen moves at a fixed rate, the enemies come in a fixed pattern, they move through the fixed pixels of the screen. Your actions have an effect on that, but the entire game is 100% reproducible every time. Compared to a lot of twin stick games are not necessarily like that. Like they can be, but there's a lot of kind of random elements. And yeah, like Tim was saying, one of the things we really tried to focus on was how can you introduce that element of the player is determining their own future or in control of the elements that are going to be happening to them that would otherwise appear random to someone who's just watching. And yeah, we drive things. The power up, the type of power up that drops is based on the second, and that's in all levels, not just the bosses. The enemy spawn locations, where they spawn, and which enemies spawn at which times are based on your exact location versus relative position of each spawner has a min and max, kind of range that you can be to it, as well as the order in which you defeat the enemies. They kind of have min and max ranges of how many, like a wave could be 10 of this type of enemy, but only 6 of them can be spawned at a time, and only 20 can be spawned total of all types, So if you were to move the exact same way, shoot the exact same way, and pick up everything in the exact same way, you could theoretically reproduce the exact same game across our whole game from start to finish.
Oh, cool.
But it's virtually impossible because we're using a lot of kind of minutia of elements. Your exact location, for example, is very hard to control in an analog game, and so it becomes this determined chaos.
So yeah, the philosophy was I wanted to make a game that was chaotic but wasn't randomly determined. So chaos is good if you don't really understand or can't really predict or reproduce the result. That's okay, but as long as under the hood, it's not just randomly choosing and you can't get lucky on certain runs. That was okay for me. My fear when I was implementing these decisions as well was that we would end up with a situation where the leaderboard would get locked step scores.
Yeah.
That was my biggest fear, that you end up basically with the exact same score number, or there would be a maximum score cap for a level. Someone would hit the theoretical cap, and that would be this kind of, and you couldn't go any further because we have a fixed number of enemies, and the enemies are worth a fixed number of points. We cap the chain level, so once you've chained like 12 enemies in a row, there's no more skill that'll give you more score for the enemies. And what's left is, in fact, in our case, all that's left is multi-kill bonuses when you destroy enemies in a very small window, and the time bonus. Now, the cool thing about that, though, is time bonus is very granular, because we can put that down to the second microsecond to set the score. And time bonus actually works against multi-kills, because if you want to increase the number of simultaneous kills you get in the game, you tend to slow down and start pacing yourself to line up these big multiple kills, which takes a little bit longer in the level. And suddenly you've got this trade-off. Like, do you go for pure speed, or do you try to go for pure finesse?
Mm-hmm.
And then the result, you have to go somewhere in the middle, and that middle is like actually really variable. So that's how I tried to keep people off hitting this kind of score.
And it plays back into the systems we were talking about, where there might be a slightly safer section of the level that you need to go to if you're, you took too many risks and you push your health too low, but you don't want to get knocked down. But by going there, you're giving up split seconds that you could be defeating enemies by being closer to where they're going to come at you from. So there's enough interesting variance and kind of dynamics at play that even with a completely deterministic system, it's almost, it's very hard for people to determine what is the literal best thing to do, that they just hit the cap. And in our score, we have a lot of people who are close to each other, but there's enough variance amongst the people who are full chaining, full defeating the entire level, maybe 50 to 100 people who have done that on a level. And they're still, each one of them, making a difference from each other.
Oh, that's good. Cool. Two things popped in my mind when you guys were explaining sort of your systems here. One is, I don't know if you've ever played Advance Wars at all, but it's a strategy game on the GBA and the DS, and my favorite iteration is the Days of Ruin. It's the latest one they made. And one of the main reasons why it's my favorite is, they cleaned up a lot of things with the CO meter, and they toned it down from the DS version, which was like fighting 2 battles at once with 2 COs and go crazy because everything on the DS is 2, right? 2 screens. Let's have fun. But the scoring system in particular, they tweaked the way that they evaluated battle scores. And like you were saying, in the previous Advance Wars, it's all power, speed, and technique, they call it. So power, they determined how many enemies you destroyed compared to how many shots you took. The fewer shots and the more destroyed enemies, wow, you're strong. You blew them up with 1 hit each. Speed, obvious, the number of days, and then technique. They calculate that based on sort of the number of units you lose and or make, right? So if it's a map that allows you to make a lot of units and you make very few and then still beat it quickly and have a lot of power, like you're the greatest tactician ever. So that's really cool. They kind of messed up in the previous ones because they didn't knock the player for building more units. It actually improved your score. So instead of saying like, you build 100 units right at the end when you're the most powerful and you're about to stomp the computer, that actually increases the ratio of technique, which buffs their score. And you're like, all of a sudden you're like, well, obviously I just need to get a little advantage, save up a bunch of money, screw speed. I can buff my technique a lot and cruise in. So that's the previous games. In Days of Ruin, they actually make it to where, like I said before, the fewer units you build and the more power and the more speed, they're counter to each other. So if you want to have more power, you would often build more units, which takes more time. If you want to have more technique, then once again that works against time and power in certain ways. So you could fan out your power to have more coverage of the map, but more of your guys will be destroyed. And like you were saying with your scoring system, putting that into your game puts the stress on the player to figure out either what's best for their skill set, their play style, or just solving a complex problem. It's always engaging, I think.
Yeah. I talk a lot about it being like tension. So you have you're competing goals, and they force you to rather than say I'm just going to maximize this, I'm just going to go all out in this. You you're going, but I also have to keep worry about this, and it keeps you so much more interesting, I think, as both a player and a designer, to have systems that pull you one way or another. And that was really intentional. We're kind of really going after that. And I love those kind of triangle ones. And like a straight line's okay, triangle's the best because it gives you this nice like uncertainty about which way you should go. It's a really good design pattern, I think.
Yeah, the most elegant loop that you can put in, the triangle, the 3 points, very easy to remember, also to understand the interconnected relationships. Yeah, can't beat those triangles. Very good.
Yeah, the iron triangle between green armor and firepower, right?
Yeah, that was because that was on the when you were doing tank stuff, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, before this, I worked at Sega, and part of it was we were looking at strategy games. They worked on Total War games, thinking about different things. And when it came to analyzing modern equipment, you have the tanks, and it's all in the iron triangle of the different attributes of a tank, which come down to how light can you make it versus how much firepower can you put on it, and how much armor you can have on it, and where do you put those. And it works for everything. Like, people have been using the triangle as a way to determine where to focus for forever.
Very cool. Man, it sounds like we covered this pretty big topic of balance, right? Very well. You guys brought in a lot of specifics. It was a really good conversation. I'm glad we got a chance to have it. So, just any closing thoughts or comments you want to make, things you want to plug about the game, or just your everyday lives as developers?
I think we plug the game a lot. My closing comment would be that like, if someone listens to this and they're thinking about design and looking at their own game, the way that I have found the most useful and most interesting to do design is consider that everything you do is a decision, even if you're deciding to just do something someone else has done, or kind of go with what you consider to be a standard solution. So basically, having a reason for everything you do is the best way to avoid winding up in a position you don't want to be in.
I suppose actually at GDC we went to the last year, the one we got to go to, which was really cool. We went to Eugene Jarvis's
the Robotron talk.
Yeah, post-mortem on Robotron.
Awesome.
And we got to see him speak about how he designed the game in 1981, I think, because the game came out in 1982.
Wow.
And it was hilarious because he was talking about the intent of the game, and it kind of lined up with what we were doing a lot. And it was like, oh, that's eerie. And the way he talked about design was amazing because each of the enemies, it was like a layered approach. They first built the default little guys that come after you and just shoot bullets, and obviously they're the enemy, they're the standard enemy. And every enemy beyond that had a different way of moving and a different purpose that overlapped with the previous enemies. So it was like, once you found that the best strategy was to sit in a corner and shoot, these are the guys that kill you if you sit in a corner. Once you find that if you straight around in a circle, these are the guys that will kill you if you don't take care of them quickly. And obviously, this is the Geometry Wars. Yeah, sorry, not successor. The what do you call it? The precursor to Geometry Wars and all these games. But to see it laid out so clearly when there was no template at all was just like awe-inspiring, actually. And it was really cool to see. So basic and so solid, just laid out in front of us.
Yeah, we talk about solving problems and playing hundreds of twin-stick shooters across, different platforms when we started our game, and we're drawing on the cumulative knowledge and effort of people for the last 20 to 30 years, and they were coming at this fresh, and they've made again a test of time until now. It's still so pure, so interesting. The concept of this tapestry of enemies that create, that force you to play the game in so many different ways, and you will find the path of least resistance 100 times when you play Robotron. Like Tim says, I can stand in the corner, and then you introduce something, I can't do that, I can circle around them, I can't do that, I can, eventually get to the point at the top level.
I'll leave the survivors to last,
and
the brains steal them.
Yeah, you can't do, there's all the easy ways to avoid having to play that game in interesting ways are slowly removed through their tapestry of enemies, and it's just brilliant. I felt very sad at the end when I realized that everyone's been reinventing the wheel for 30 years.
But to come back to Nat's point, I I think it's the same thing. It's designing with intent. It's making sure that everything in the game is either reinforcing or building or is in response to, or even just setting up tension with something. I thought that was really cool.
Very good. Excellent talk. Design oriented, we're always interested in extending the conversation. We'll be covering Assault Android Cactus, talking about the video and just doing a whole series on shmups. So definitely all of this is going to be falling under that. If you ever want to chat about design again, you know where to find us. We're always open to a conversation about anything, any game, any weird thought that comes to mind. We're open. But it's been great talking to both of you, and I hope to talk again soon.
Yeah, great fun.
Thanks.
Thank you.